get up to the last two words on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, Iboilahu. So this Gemara that we're about to learn is going to raise a suffix about two tsaros that fell for Yibum, and which chalitza should come first in a very complicated case. So we turn now to Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. So let's just give names here to what we're about to study. Shimon dies, and he has two wives, Sarah and Rivka, that fall to Reuven. Now, Reuven should have chosen one of those two wives, either Sarah or Rivka, to do chalitza, but instead, he chooses to do a more complicated thing, both with regard to Sarah and with regard to Rivka. He's going to give one of them what's called maimar, and the other a get. Again, he really messed up here. Instead of going down the right path, the well-trodden path of chalitza, he went down two other paths with regard to, respective to both Sarah and Rivka, the two Yevamos. So with regard to Sarah, he gave a maimar, which on a Rabbanan level is called Kiddushin. And the Rabbanan recognized maimar when he says Arayat Mekudeshesli, and he gives her some Shavah Kesef. They recognize that, again, the Rabbanan, as a marriage which generates an Isur of Erva, only with Rabbanan are all her krovos. He'll never be able to marry any of her relatives because he married her. Now, that's with regard to Sarah. Now we get to Rivka. With regard to Rivka, instead of giving Rivka chalitza, he chose to give Rivka a get. And again, on a Doraisa level, that get is meaningless. I mean, there's a Zikas Hebrew, which requires chalitza, but get is, there's no issues here for Gerish. Okay, so now he has a maimar with Sarah and a get with Rivka. And now the Gemara is going to vacillate back and forth as to which chalitza should come first. In other words, he messed up, as we said before, maimar instead of yibum, get instead of chalitza. So what does he do now? So let's go through the Gemara first, and we'll try to analyze the sugya. One side of the Gemara is the following: that the chalitza, if let's say the second, I'm calling her the second Sarah number 2, which is Rivka, and Sarah is Sarah number 1. The reason I'm using those numbers is because since he gave maimar first to Sarah, he's no longer allowed to marry Rivka. And that's midrabanan, because maimar is recognized as kiddushin, and he's now prohibited from marrying Rivka. Now, what that does is, it makes the chalitza to Rivka. If, let's say you would start with Rivka, she's called the balas get in the next two words of the Gemara, into a chalitza psula. Do you remember we discussed this once? Chalitza psula is a no-choice chalitza. What do I mean by no-choice chalitza? He doesn't have an option of yibum for whatever reason. In this case, he doesn't have an option of yibum because he gave maimar to Sarah. Since there's no option to be miyabim Rivka, the chalitza to Rivka is classified as a chalitza psula, which means that although under normal circumstances, in an ideal world, a chalitza to one of two tsaros hatas up the other tzara. She doesn't need any chalitza. She already goes out with the chalitza to her tzara. But in the case of chalitza psula, every single one of the Yevamos requires her own personal chalitza. Therefore, the Gemara wants to know, in terms of the seder, of the sequence, should he start with balas haget, which means that Rivka, we said, was the Balas Haget, and he's going to give now Chalitza to Rivka, because again, although Rivka received a get from Reuven, she cannot marry anyone. She's still bound to Yibum because there was neither Yibum nor Chalitza. There was only a get. So again, the Rabbanan recognize that get like a Chalitza, but it's not a Chalitza. It's the Rabbanan. It's Chalitza in the sense that she can no longer marry, that he can no longer marry the other tzara. Why? Because when you give Chalitza to one tzara, you can't marry the other tzara. She becomes now Eishes Achiv, an Erva. So Midrabanan, the other tzara, in this case Sarah, becomes an Erva of Eishes Achiv once he gave a get to Rivka. And now we have another possibility of Ubalas Maimer. Now we go back to Sarah. We said that Reuven had done a Maimer with Sarah. And as a result of the Maimer with Sarah, he's Asur to Rivka. So it seems that whichever way you turn, whether he gives Chalitza to the Balas Haget or to the Balas Maimer, in either case, the Chalitza is called and classified as a Chalitza Psula, because in both cases there's an Isur Yibum, albeit the Rabbanan, but nevertheless an Isur Yibum. So on a Rabbanan level, the Chalitza is downgraded to the level of a Chalitza Psula because there's no possibility of Yibum. So let's just summarize the following principles. Principle number one is that whenever there's no possibility of Yibum, the Chalitza is classified and defined as a Chalitza Psula. That's principle number one. Principle number two, a Chalitza Psula does not effectuate a Ptur for the other tzara, which means that after a Chalitza Psula, the other tzara, or it could be many tzaros, require their own Chalitza. Principle number three is that both in the cases of Balas Get and the case of Balas Maimer, we have a Chalitza Psula. Why? In the case of the Balas Haget, which means Rivka, there the Chalitza is a Chalitza Psula because of the Maimar that he did with Sarah. In the case of the Balas Maimar, that Chalitza to Sarah would be a Chalitza Psula as a result of the get that he gave to Rivka. So the Gemara now vacillates, Ezo Mehen Kodemis. Is there a preference on a sequential level? Which of the two Chalitzos would be our first choice, so to speak? And we'll go through the Gemara and see how the Gemara analyzes this. The Gemara says the following. On the one hand, we have a strong svara to vote in favor of Rivka. Rivka is the Balas Haget. Her Chalitza is called Adifa. Adifa means Kodemis. Kodemis, in sequence, it should come first. What is the svara to push me in favor to vote in favor of the Balas Haget in favor of Rivka, that Rivka's Chalitza should come first? What makes the Chalitza to Rivka superior, so to speak, to the Chalitza to Sarah, who's the Balas Maimar? And the Gemara suggests the following svara, Mishum the Aschil Ba B'Chalitza. Get and Chalitza are both, shall we say, like twins. They're very similar to each other. What the definition of both get and Chalitza is Hafkoas Ishus. In the case of Chalitza, it's Hafkoas Zikas Ishus. In the case of a get, had it been a normal, regular get, classic get, it would be Hafkoas Ishus Lagamri, a full-fledged Ishus. But because of the striking similarity in the goal of both get and Chalitza, Askil Ba B'Chalitza, even though we call the Reuven, started by giving a get to Rivka. In other words, he hasn't done a Chalitza, he hasn't performed a Chalitza, but nevertheless, he has to some extent performed the Chalitza. meaning he's begun the process of hafkas issues by giving her a get, which the Rabbanan recognized as a get. And therefore, since get is ke'en chalitza, it's very similar to chalitza. In both cases, be mafkia either issues or zikas issues. Therefore, a chalitza should follow a get, meaning get begins a process, and the continuation of the clincher of that process is the chalitza. So the chalitza, in a sense, rides on the back of the get in order to create a complete tour. Because again, as such, before the chalitza to Rivka is not allowed to marry anyone. Even though she received a get from the Yavam, from Ruvain, get on a derais level is not enough. You must have chalitza to be mafkia zika. So she's still in the get there on the derais level of skukum omedes. She must have chalitza, but her chalitza will be now a clincher, if you will, a continuation and a completion of the process that began with get. And therefore, her chalitza should come first. And this is in contrast to the chalitza to Sarah, because the chalitza to Sarah is coming on the wake of what? Of Maimar. Maimar is the opposite of chalitza. The purpose of Maimar is to create issues. The purpose of chalitza is to remove issues or zikas issues. So that's the first side in the Gemara. So that the chalitza of Rivka, the balas get, is adifa to the chalitza of the balas hamayim. It's not a chalitza. It is a chalitza psul, I think. We'll have to study that. But nevertheless, it's a stronger chalitza that gets preference over the chalitza psula of the balas mayim. Okay, now Odil, what's the push in favor of, as we said before, voting for the chalitza Sarah to take preference? Balas Maimar Adifa Mishum de Krovo Libia. What is Maimar? Maimar is on the way to Ishus. And to some extent, Rabbanan recognized this Maimar. So that gives the Balas Maimar Adifus that her chalitza should come before the chalitza of Rivka, the Balas Haget, because the bia, in a sense, is upgrading, or shall we say, intensifying, for lack of a better word, the zikas yibum. It's krovel bia. You follow what I mean? What is zikas yibum? Zikas yibum is on the way to creating a relationship of kirva, of bia. And he sort of intensified that zika by upgrading it, adding a maimah. Okay, fine. So therefore, her chalitza, meaning Sarah Balas HaMaimar, is adifa, is ma'ula, it's like strong, it's chazaka, because that chalitza has to accomplish a greater goal. Normally, the goal of chalitza, the purpose of chalitza is to remove what? Zika. But now we have, in addition to Zika, we have a maima, which, as we said before, intensifies the Zika. So now what you need is a chalitza, which is going to achieve more than it normally achieves. Again, all this is the Rabbana. On a deraisa level, nothing has changed in the chalitza. But on the Rabbana level, since we recognize the maimar, and that upgrades the issues from a level of Zika to a level of almost like Krovalabia, which Gemara calls, means almost a full-fledged issues. Because now, by the way, she's going to need a get to remove the maimar. Again, all this is Rabbanan, but she'll need a get. The fact that she needs a get means that the issues is a complete issues. And now the chalitza has to, in Yiddish we say tu'ayf, right? It has to accomplish something more than a normal chalitza would accomplish, because she's more than just a zkuka. She is now almost like a full-fledged Ashes each. So the chalitza really is that much more powerful and that much more far-reaching. It has to accomplish a greater goal. And therefore, when we compare it to the chalitza, to the Balas Haget, in the case of Rivka, the Balas Haget, her Ishus was downgraded, was reduced from Zika down to get. Right? To get, the purpose of get is to remove the Ishus. So that chalitza, so to speak, a weak chalitza. Again, all these concepts are only D'Rabbanan. On a D'Oraisa level, there's no difference between the chalitza to Rivka and the chalitza to Sarah, because the Torah doesn't recognize neither a get in the case of Yevamot, nor a Maimar in the case of Yevamot. But on a D'Rabbanan level, recognizing both the get to Rivka and the Maimar to Sarah, we are going in opposite directions, meaning whereas the get to Rivka is coming to downgrade the Zika, the Maimar to Sarah is coming to upgrade the Zika. And the Gemara thinks that we are pulled in two directions here as to which chalitza is adifa, it should get a superior status, should get a higher grade, so to speak. On the one hand, we're pulled in the direction of the Balas Haget because that get is the beginning of chalitza. So you started a process of hafkas ishus with a get, completed with a chalitza. On the other hand, we should vote in favor of the Balas Maimar, meaning Sarah, because here the chalitza plays a superior role in that the Maimar upgraded the ishus, and therefore the chalitza has to accomplish more than it normally would accomplish. Now, I want to quote to you a kasha of the Rishonim here. They don't understand why the Balas Haget is adif. What does it mean? Kevich hiskil baba chalitza. Adarab. Hasvara lehepeth. Okay, these are the Rishonim who are trying to reinterpret the Gemara. Our Gemara has been interpreted in the light of Rashi, but the Rishonim are not happy. He says the following: the chalitza, in the case of the Balas Haget, is a chalitza grua. Why? Because the get already began the process of hafkas ish, again on a D'Rabbanan level. Chalitza is just a weak chalitza. It's just coming to clinch it, to go the last half a mile. But most of what was accomplished in terms of hafkas ishus was accomplished by the get. I mean, a get is so powerful that it removes a full-fledged ishus. So that if you're comparing the chalitza of the Balas Haget to that of the Balas Maimar, certainly the get to the Balas Maimar, I'm sorry, if you're comparing, excuse me, for the chalitza to the Balas Get to the chalitza to the Balas Maimar, then certainly the chalitza to the Balas Maimar is greater, and it has to achieve that much more because the Maimar made it even more difficult to remove that ishus, that zika. Therefore, chalitza should be, but certainly in the case of the Balas Get, the chalitza is a weaker chalitza. It's what you call a chalitza grua, because you've already started the process with the get, and the chalitza is really coming just to, as we said before, the last half a mile of the hafkas ishus. So therefore, the Rishonim offer an alternative explanation of why the Gemara thinks in the first side that Balas Haget adifa. Why is the chalitza to the Balas Haget to Rivka? Why does that get first preference? And they say pirush mishum shenasa ba ma'isa odif yoser. That if we compare a get to chalitza, get is odif yoser. It's a Maisa Adif Yoser. I guess you'd say in English, it's more powerful. The get is more powerful. Agorem Shechalitzasa Husa Yoser Mibala Samayim. So how is that different than Rashi? That's what I can't figure out. I was hoping you gentlemen would help me out. Again, I'll read it one more time. He says, Balas Haget Adifa Pirush Shenasa Nasa Ba Maisa Adif Yosef. Those are the key words. I read it 5 times, and again, the language is certainly different than what we've been saying until now. I mean, until now we've been saying that the get is Hafkas Ishus, and that's the Haskola, and now you only have to go that far, that half a mile to complete the process with Chalitza. That puts Chalitza on a higher level. But the Rishonim don't agree with that. They think that makes Chalitza on a lower level. It's a Chalitza Grua because it's almost a hinka, it's a limping Chalitza. It's not really doing much. But now they're saying, as a substitute, that why is the Chalitza Babalas Get Adifa? Because Naseba Maisa Adif Yosef. Because she already had a get, which is a Maisa Adif Yosef. If you compare get on a scale of 1 to 10 to Chalitza, then get is 100. They're all 10. And Chalitza is only 55. I can't tell you what he means here. I can only say the following, that the shift now is from comparing Chalitza after get, right? You started with get, that's the Aschola, and you're completing it with Chalitza. The Rishonim don't like that. So they're shifting it over to the Yevama herself. We're not focused on the process of Hafkas issues, because the conclusion of that analysis should be that Chalitza's Balas Haget is Grua Yosef, not Mu'ula Yosef, but Grua Yosef. So let's shift our emphasis over to the Yevama herself, not the Maisa, but the Yevama. And from the perspective of the Yevama, right, from the perspective of the Yevama, she's like, I don't know what word to use, she's like embracing or reaching out to achieve, to sort of upgrade the Maisa Gomor. She already had a Maisa Gomor, right? What was the Maisa Gomor? The get, right? The get is a Maisa Gomor, according to these Rishonim. So she's saying, look, I have rights here, so to speak, to Chalitza. I'm already demanding Chalitza. What gives me first dibs and I should get preference in the sequence for Chalitza? Because I already had a Maisa Gomor. Just that the Rabbanan is saying that that's not enough. Or the Torah is saying that's not enough. And the Torah is requiring a Maisa Chalitza. So she has a right to say she's holding on to a Maisa Gomor now. Right? She puts her cards on the table and it says, I got a Maisa Gomor. Give me what I need in order to allow me to marry someone else, Minashuk. And then finally, at the end of this presentation, he quotes the Ritva. You have, John has it. Okay, so the Ritva says that L'chalitza shall kol achas mehen yesh maila v'chisar. Each chalitza, the Baal Segeda and the Baal Seimer, has a plus and a minus. Chalitza's Baal Saget, on the one hand, Kevan sheniklisha zikasa, right? She already got a get, so the zika is now downgraded. It's diluted, if I can use that word. It's diluted zika is therefore chalitzasa pchusa. Therefore, her chalitza is downgraded. That's what we call the chalitza grua. She already is well on the way to removing the Zika has already been diminished and diluted. Omnom, the chalitzasa, poter es zikasa legamre. Her chalitza now completely removes the Zika, which I guess is the Mila, that's the plus of the superior status of the chalitza of the Baal Saget. Okay, now let's go over to the other side. Ubebalas hamaymar lehepech. Why? On the one hand, it's not a diluted Zika, Zikasa ma'ula. We've upgraded the Zika through what? Through Maimon. And that means that the chalitza is a high-level chalitza, which has to remove a Zika ma'ula. No, but the flip side of it is that b'chalitzasa ein nifteres zikasa legam. Those are the key words they have the Ritva, which I don't know what that means. Just 1 second. In other words, since she already what? A maimar. Oh, I know what it means. That she needs a get. Because the Rabbanan said that once she has a maimar, chalitza is not enough, she needs a get. So on the one hand, her chalitza is superior because it has to remove an upgraded zika. She's already had an ishus through maimar. But on the other hand, what does this chalitza to us? Not much. She still needs a get. She can't marry anyone without a get. In the case of the Balas Haget, on the one hand, the chalitza is a lower level chalitza because it doesn't have to accomplish much. She's already well on the way towards removing her ishus through the get. But on the other hand, the chalitza is perfect in that she doesn't need anything else. She already got a get. So she doesn't need anything beyond the chalitza. In the case of the Balas HaMaimar, she's going to need a chalitza lezikasa plus a get limamara. For Safek HaGemara, Milas Mimehen Adif. Very interesting sugya. I mean, it's nothing like I'm used to. This is totally left field for me. Omer of Ashi Tachma. So he quotes a brisa from a Gemara later on in Daf Nunah. Umoder Rav Gamliel sheyesh get achar maimon. Okay, so now we're entering into a whole sugi. What's the case? We're going to have machlokas here between the Chachamim and Rav Gamliel about the following case. Let's see if we can get the case. Shimon, as we said before, has 2 wives, Sarah and Rivka. He dies without children, and both Sarah and Rivka fall for Yibum to Reuven. Reuven now gives a get to Sarah. Okay, that's familiar to us, correct? Oh, actually, the names have changed a little bit, right? Because we said before he gave a get to Rivka and a maimar to Sarah. Okay. I'm assuming, I'm following here the Masifta's diagram. I'm assuming there's a reason why he changes the names. Maybe just that we shouldn't confuse the 2 sugis. In any event, that's what he has. We'll accept it at face value. So Reuven now gave a get to Sarah. Okay, then? Now, what is the repercussion of the get to Sarah? Pasal osa v'sarosa minayim. As we mentioned earlier, the Rabbanan recognizing this get generate an iser on the krovos of the get. Okay, now, so he can no longer marry Sarah because he gave her a get. And now she goes back on a Drabbana level to Eishes Achiv. And on the other hand, he can no longer marry Rivka Hatzara because the get to Sarah apostles Rivka for Yibum. And he can't marry the relatives of Sarah because the get is like Chalitza. And Chalitza generates an Isser and a Psul of Yibum. Okay. So again, Reuven gave a get to Sarah. Now what does he do? He gives a second get to Rivka. So it's different than the first case that we had where he gave a get to one of the two tsaros and mimer to the other. Here, he gives a get to both of them. He gave a get to Sarah, and as we said before, that get passes her and her tsara from Yivu, and he can no longer marry any of Sarah's relatives. And now he gives a get to Rivka. What's the status of the get to Rivka? And here we have the shita of Rabbi Gamliel, which is called Ein Get Liachar Get. What does that mean? The get to Rivka is not a valid get, which means that if Reuven decides to marry one of the relatives of Rivka, he's allowed to do so. So whereas the first get generated an Iser Bekrovov, the second get, according to Rabbi Gamliel, does not generate an Iser Lekrovov Sel. The first get that he gave to Sarah, on a Doraisa level, is not a get because Sarah is the Yevamot and she needs Chalitza, not a get. But the Rabbanan recognize the get, and as a result, he cannot marry the relatives of Sarah. So that's the implication of the get, the repercussion of the get. But now, says Rabbi Gamliel, the second get, which he gave to Rivka, is not a valid get, and therefore he's allowed to marry the relatives of Rivka. And the reason for this is because the get that he first gave a get to Sarah, correct? He never gave a chalitza to Sarah, at this point, correct? So the get of Sarah, although on a doraisa level, it's not chalitza, but yet the Rabbanan upgraded the status of the get. Now we're talking about Sarah, and they considered it like chalitza. Now we have a principle called Ein Chalitza Achar Chalitza, which means the following: that let's say two Sarah fall for Yibum, and the Yavam implemented Chalitza to one of them, the second Chalitza to the other one is meaningless. And Rabbi Gamliel is now going to make an equation between the following two principles. Principle number one is Ein Chalitza Achar Chalitza, and principle number two is Ein Get Liachar Get. That just like the second Chalitza to the second Sarah is meaningless because he already gave Chalitza to the first Sarah, and once he gave Chalitza to the first Sarah, all the Sarahs are no longer Pturos Min HaYibum, so the second Chalitza is meaningless. We're going to now apply the same rule, says Rav Gamliel, to Get Liachar Get. We're not going to recognize the second get because he already gave the first get to the other Sarah, meaning he gave a get to Sarah, and therefore the subsequent get to Rivka is not recognized. It's not valid, which is good news because now he's allowed to marry Rivka's relatives. Okay. Now, what happens in the following scenario? And we're going to try to create a parallel in the following scenario. Reuven, instead of giving a get to Sarah, he gave Sarah Maimar. And as a result of that Maimar, he's no longer allowed to marry her krobos because it's as if he was married to her. Now, Sarah, if she wants to marry someone, it's not enough for her to get chalitza from Ruvain. She needs, in addition, a get. Why? Because she had a maimer, and the maimer generates an ishus derabana that requires a get to break up that ishus. Now, Ruvain does a second maimer to Rivka. And Rabbi Gamliel is going to now apply a principle of ein maimar achar maimar. So what we have is the following. We started with ein chalitza achar chalitza, and we applied that to what? To get. Ein get liachar get. And now we're adding another principle of Rabbi Gamliel, which is almost identical, at least structurally, and that is that ein maimar achar maimar. So when Ruvain does Maimar to Rivka after he had already done Maimar to Rachel, that second Maimar to Rivka doesn't register at all, and he can now marry the relatives of Rivka. Does Rivka need a get? The answer is no. Why? Because that Maimar to Rivka is invalid because it ain't Maimar achar Maimar. It doesn't register. So whereas the Maimar to Rachel, now, what was her name? Sarah, right? I don't want to get mixed up with the names. The Maimar to Sarah registers Mirabanan as a Maimar because it was the first Maimar. So Sarah, could not marry anyone without both Chalitza and Get. In the case of Rivka, even though Ruvain again did a Maimar, that second Maimar is null and void because of Ein Maimar achar Maimar, and hence Rivka does not need a Get. So there are two rewards over here, two benefits to apply the principle of Ein Maimar achar Maimar from Gamliel. Number one, he could marry the relatives of Rivka, and number two, Rivka can get married to anyone she wants to with chalitza, and she doesn't need a get. So that's Rabbi Gamliel on Daf Nun Aleph. Comes along the brisa that's quoted here by Rav Ashi and says the following: Moder Rav Gamliel sheyesh get achar maimar. So what happens now? In this case, Ruvain started with maimar to Sarah, and then subsequently he gave a get to Rivka. And now we're going to say Moder Rav Gamliel yesh get achar maimar. The get of Rivka is recognized as a get, which means he's not allowed to marry her relatives, and she's going to need a maimar. She's going to need. So the get. What are we saying? Yesh get liachar maimar, right? Yesh get liachar maimar. So now Rivka has a get. That get is valid. So again, Rivka doesn't need another get, that's for sure. She just needs chalitza. And once you're validating the get, then you're generating an isur with regard to Ruvain vis-a-vis the relatives of Rivka. Why? Because through the get, he becomes asura b'krovosel. But now we have to go back to Sarah for a second. What did he do with Sarah? He gave her maimar, correct? But now he gave a get to Rivka. And once we recognize the validity of that get, because yesh get liachar maimar, right? In the case of these two tzaros, so then he can no longer be married to Sarah, because the get itself generates an Isa to Sarah. Even though, again, Reuven wanted to marry Sarah. I mean, he gave her Kedusha, he gave her Maimah. But once he gives the get to Rivka, he can no longer marry Sarah. He writes here, Kevon Shemoyel HaGet, since the get to Rivka is a valid get, Yesh alav Iser lo yivne leba'al hasamayim. Right, we have a pasuk lo yivne, which means that if a yavam gives chalitza to the yavama, he can never marry, because she automatically reverts to being an eshes ach. And the same thing applies if he gives a get. Once he gives a get, then he has, so to speak, as a quasi chalitza, he has rejected the possibility of yibum for this whole bias. And therefore the get to Rivka is going to generate an iser to Rachel, the Baal HaSamayim. Now, here's another case where Rav Gamliel, what's the word I want to use, admits to the Chachamim or accepts the Chachamim. Maimar achar get. What's the case of Maimar achar get? So we said that Reuven gave a get to Sarah. After he gave a get to Sarah, he did a maimar with Rivka. Is that maimar valid? And the answer is yes, it's valid, because it's a maimar achar get. Just like we said before, get li achar maimar is valid, and we recognize the get. So too, a maimar achar get, we recognize the maimar. And the upshot of that is that Rivka, once she gets a maimar, she's going to require a get limamora. And once again, we're going to say that the maimar will generate an iser onto Reuven of Krovosel. So that's Rav Gamliel. Now, what does this have to do with the original suffix in the case where he started with Maimar to Sarah, and then he continued with a get to Rivka, and the question was, which chalitza came first? Says Rav Ashi, he get odif get odif odif. Right, we're talking about Maimar achar get, I believe. Let's see if I'm right. So in the case of Maimar achar get, so Reuven gave a get to, I get mixed up a little with the names here. Give me a second, Rabosa, if you don't mind. Which is the case by giving get. So our case, the Suffolk case was that he started with a mimer to Sarah. But where's the case with the get? What's the last case? Get. No, that can't. It's got to be mimer liachar get. What's the case of mimer the achar get? Oh, so mimer liachar get. Let's focus on mimer liachar get. That was the last case that we had. So mimer liachar get, we said meant that he started by giving a get to Sarah, and then he did a mimer to Rivka. So the get adif. What does it mean adif here in this case? He gave a get first to who? To Sarah. Adif, that's better than what happened afterwards. He gave a get. No, he did a mimer. Adif, get adif means get adif means mimer. Is Lola heavy Maimar. Abasre. So let me just make a point here, just to move forward a little bit. You know, you have to really move inch by inch through this sugya. I think what the Gemara is saying is that if we compare Rav Gamliel to our original Suffolk, there's a certain striking similarity. That's Rav Ashi's point. In both cases, the issue hinges on the word adifa. That's the key, I think, the code word here in this whole thing. In our Suffolk, originally, Iboilahu, we wanted to know which is adifa. And we had the Balas Maimar, we had the Balas Haget, and we were trying to vacillate back and forth, which is adifa. So Rav Ashi thinks that issue of which is adifa between Balas Maimer and Balas Get should have an impact on Rav Gamliel. Why? Because Rav Gamliel wants to know if you have a sequence, let's say you start with a get first, and then you have a Maimer second. And you're comparing now get to Maimar, and you want to decide whether the Maimar is effective after a get, that depends on adifa. So the issue of adifa will determine not only which chalitza should come first in that case, but also whether or not the second following the first could be chal, whether or not it's valid. So therefore the Gemara says that get adiv, if we're going to come to the conclusion in our original suffix that the Balas Haget gets adifus, let's say because as we discussed, it already has removed part of the Zika, part of the issues, and therefore it gets adifus over the chalitza. So that should have an impact on Rabbi Gamliel in the case where, let's say, he started with a get to Sarah, and then he went and gave and he gave a mimer in that last case that we mentioned of Yesh Mimer Liachar Get. It means he gave a mimer to Rivka following the get that he gave to Sarah. Is Lola Hani Mimer. In other words, once if you've upgraded get to a superior position, so that Sarah that received the get, which we said was Sarah, that's Adiv, then Lola Heni Mimer. Then when Ruvain subsequently gives Maimar to, what's her name, to Rivka, that Maimar should not register. Whereas Rabbi Gamliel said, Yesh Maimar Achar Get. So what was the upshot of Yesh Maimar Achar Get? That when Rivka gets a Maimar after Sarah had already received the get, that Maimar is valid, and now Rivka can't get married without a get because of that Maimar. And that Maimar generates an Isur for Reuven to marry any of Rivka's relatives. So Rav Ashi thinks that this statement, this position of Rav Gamliel would make no sense if we assume that get is Adif Mimaimar. If get is Adif Mimaimar, then the Maimar should not register. Why does Rav Gamliel validate the Maimar of Rivka after the get that Reuven gave to Sarah, with all the repercussions of the validity of that Maimar, recognizing it as valid? That Maimar should not register at all because get Adif Mimaimar. And where do we see the get is Adif Mimaimar? We saw it in one side in the suffix that we raised before, in which we would like to give preference to the Balas Haget over and above the Balas HaMaimar, which means the get is a default. Somehow, Rav Ashi is able to abstract. Is there a verb called abstract? To abstract? I don't know. He's able to abstract the concept of adifa to such an extent that you can apply that concept of adifa in different permutations and in different ways. In the first case of adifa, which there's one side now Gemara to say that Balas Haget is adifa. And why is Balas Haget adifa? Is because get takes precedence over Maimar. Get is more powerful than Maimar. Why? Because get is well on the way to remove the issue. So that gives get an upgraded status. Once you've accepted that principle, which is one side of the Gemara suffix, that get is adifa, then we cannot justify Rabbi Gamliel's position of Yesh Maimar Achar Get, because if get is adifa, then the Maimar should be completely null and void. It loses its entire status. And therefore, Lola Heavy Maimar, Lola Hani Maimar, again, it's a big nafkamina, because we're saying that if Rivka gets a Maimar, then according to Rabbi Gamliel, we've just established that Rivka cannot marry anyone without a get. You with me? That if you're saying Yesh Maimar get, then Rivka, who got the Maimar, cannot get married without a get. But now we're saying, according to one side and now a suffix, that get is Adif Mimaimar. If get is Adif Mimaimar, then how can Rav Gamliel recognize the Maimar to Rivka, the subsequent Maimar to Rivka, to require Rivka getting a get? Rav Ashi understands in an abstract world, if you hold get is Adif Mimaimar, then a Maimar Liacher get would not register. It would not be valid. Lo leheni Maimar, leheni means it shouldn't be chal, the Maimar, to require a get, or to generate an Esau and Ruvain with vis-a-vis the krovos of Rivka. That all that should be null and void. Forget about Rivka requiring a get. Forget about Ruvain being also b'krovos Sarah. The Maimar is butter. It's nothing. It's not. Why doesn't it register? Because we're holding now that get adif mi Maimar. So what word did I leave out? Lola heni Maimar abasre. Abasre means after the get. So he gave a get to Sarah, and now we're saying that get adifa, the get is well on the way to remove ishus. It's almost like chalitza. Now he writes here, "V'ein yibum moil achar chalitza." Okay, fine. Ukmochen amaymer shehu ki yibum lo yoel liknos liachar aget. Right, that just like you can't have yibum after a get, and you can't have yibum, of course, after chalitza. So if we're saying that Maimer is like Hebrew, that Maimer cannot be Kona after a get. Why? Because a get has the same status as Chalitza, again, midrabbanan. You can't have Hebrew after Chalitza. So that being the case, the Maimer is also knocked off the radar screen. Correct? Just like we're saying that there's no Yibum after the get, and that means that the get is like Chalitza, it's upgraded to the status of Chalitza, and there's no Yibum after Chalitza. So too, the Maimar should not be effective after the get. Because Maimar is like on the way to Yibum, but we're saying that once there's a get, it's considered like Chalitza, and Yibum is out of the question. It's awesome. The Maimar Adif. Now let's go with the other side. That Maimar is Adif. This is not going to be any better for us. Why? Because if you're going to tell me that Maimar is Adif, so the Maimar that he gave to Sarah, did I get the names right? Just 1 second. Yeah, now we're going back to the case. Yeah, now we're going back to the previous case of Yesh get li'achar Maimar, right? So Reuven gave a get. 1 second. I'm sorry. Reuven gave Maimar to Sarah, and then he gave a get to Rivka. So if Maimar, right? So he started with Maimar to Sarah, right? He started with Maimar to Sarah. Just gotta get the names right. Yeah. and then he gave a get to Rivka. And if you're going to tell me the mimer that he gave to Sarah is adif, why? Because mimer is considered like yibum, and it upgrades the zika, is then lola havi get. Abasre. The get that he gives to Rivka subsequently should not be meaningful, meaning he cannot generate an Isur Kukrobos. And it would generate an Isur Yibum onto Sarah. So now we're holding on the other side of the Gemara that Maimer is on. So after the Maimer that he gave to Sarah, if Maimer is Adiv, then there would be no chalitza, and therefore there would be no get. So the get could not possibly be meaningful after the Maimer. And yet, Rabbi Gamliel was modeh that yesh get achar Maimer. But now you're holding Maimer Adiv. Elolav shmamina. We have no choice but to say ki adodinin. So Rav Ashi is saying that you cannot choose one over the other. You can't choose get over Maimer or Maimer over get, because either way you're going to be messed up with Umod Rabbi Gamliel. So the only other option is ki adodinin, that the get is like chalitza and the Maimer is like yibum, and they have equal kochos. They're both equal as far as the Yivam is concerned. So therefore, both Maimar and Get are going to be effective. Mamino, and the Gemara accepts that as the final conclusion. Okay, Rabbi, say this is where we're going to start. I feel like I have to bench Gomel. This is like so tough. Yeah.
Dies against these two women. One wants to marry one. What does he have to do?
You want to change the names on me? I get confused.
Whatever.
Let's say Shimon dies. It's just a stick. If you don't mind sticking to it.
Shimon dies, has two wives, and one lady wants to marry one. What's he supposed to do?
Yeah, no, he does Yibum.
Once he does Chalitza, he can't marry either one of them.
Right, no, so he does Yibum. Yeah, he chooses one of them for Yibum. But our problem was that instead of doing either Yibum or Chalitza, he did Get and Maimer. And if he did Get with one and Maimer with the other, then we have this whole suffix about if one is Adifa. And Rav Ashi is saying that issue of one Adifa is going to have an impact on Rav Gamliel, because Rav Gamliel says Yesh Get Liachar Maimer, and he says that Yesh Maimer Liachar Get. So if he's going in both directions, then he must be upgrading them both to the same status.
So you could basically you couldn't do Yibum first. Okay.
Correct. He definitely can only marry one of them, whether it's through. Right. No, once he does Chalitza, then the ball game is over. But if he wants to do Yibum, he can do Yibum first. If he does Maimer instead of Yibum, then he's on his way towards Yibum. That means that Maimer is Adifa in the sense that it's like Yibum and it generates an Isser on all the other Tzara. And not only that, he can't marry any of her relatives. Get, on the other hand, is also Adifa. What gives the Adifas to Get? Because it's well on the way to give Chalitza. And that also is going to generate an Isser on the other Tzara and on the relatives of the Balas HaMaimer. But if you ask me at the end of the day, which is Adifa between the Balas and the Balas HaMaimer? So if not for Rabbi Gamliel, then we could have had a valid question about it. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth. And we worked very hard to figure out what the Svaras Lakan and Svaras Lakan, why should a Get be better than Chalitza? Why should Chalitza be better than a Get? I'm sorry, why should Maimer be better than a Get? But at the end of the day, the Gemara concludes that there's no Adifas over here. They're both Adifa, and neither one is Adifa. They're really shoving. They're equal one to the other.
And the Steinzel says it very well. Lashon Adifa kan ena mekuvenet hetei beyond
Yeah, so he's not willing to go into the details of the Sunnah. He just pushes it off and says, "You rack your brains."
There's a whole paragraph here. He goes, But the point
Oh,
is-
he does go
Yeah,
through. Oh, I didn't know.
Yeah, but he basically says, all because what Adifa means is unclear.
Correct. That's why I'm telling you that Rav Ashi takes the word adifa and he climbs up to some abstract world, and he says that adifa could have an impact in two different contexts, even though they're very different one from the other, but it's all comes under the adifa. Okay, Rabosai. So again, what should we say? We did what we could, and there's always room for more study, but
I just have a hard time with it's the get into consideration for Ramona because